Psalm 82:8 says that God will inherit the nations. Can I ask you guys a question? You guys ready? If God already owns creation, how can He inherit the nations if the nations are... You understand my question, folks? Here are two passages I'd like to discuss. You see it? Here it says God will inherit the nations, but doesn't God already possess the nations? By the way, interestingly, Psalm 82:8 does go with Deuteronomy 32:8. If you guys pay attention and read carefully, Psalm 82:8 goes perfectly, dovetails perfectly with Deuteronomy 32:8. So my question to you guys, how can God inherit something He already owns? He's going to inherit the nations. Doesn't He own them? Now, by the way, here's another passage that goes with this one. Speaking of Yahweh's anointed king, the king whom Yahweh anoints, who becomes His son at His coronation when He takes the throne to rule on God's behalf in Zion. What does God say to the anointed king? Psalm 2, verses 6 to 8. Psalm 2, verses 6 to 8, specifically verse 8. Carol, pay attention to this one. Remember, Psalm 82:8 says, God shall inherit the nations. Psalm 2, verses 6 to 8 says this about the anointed king. As for me, I have set my king on Zion, my holy hill, meaning in Jerusalem, the earthly Jerusalem. I will tell of the decree, Yahweh said to me, you are my son, today I have begotten you. Excellent translation. Verse 8. Ask of me, I will make the nations your heritage, and the ends of the earth your possession. The word heritage, same thing as inheritance. Now notice, God is telling the anointed king, the nations will be your inheritance. But Psalm 82:8 says, the nation shall be Yahweh's inheritance. Are you with me there, guys? Do you see it? Psalm 2:8, Psalm 82:8. Psalm 2:8, the anointed king, whom God adopts as His son, will be given the nations as His inheritance. Yep, He is a king on the throne of David. But Psalm 82:8 says, God will inherit the nations. All of them. Right? Let's post them back to back. Watch here. And now compare Psalm 2:8. So now guys, who inherits all the nations? Who inherits all the nations? Can you tell me? Carol, doesn't say Jesus. Go with the text. You're inserting words in those passages. Elohim, God, right? But that's Psalm 82:8. Psalm 2:8 says, the anointed king does. The anointed king. So is it God or the anointed king? See, these are the passages I want to unpack and study in depth by the grace of God. Okay, now here's another one. Various topics in the Old Testament, speaking of God, and how the Old Testament points to Jesus as the solution, because Jesus is the God-man who solves the riddle, the mystery of the Hebrew Scriptures. Okay, now, let me give you another one. You guys ready for another one that I want to discuss? All of these are related in some sense. Right? Here's another one. How many kings will God raise up to rule over Israel and the nations? Not just Israel, but the nations. How many kings will there be? How many shepherds? Let's go to Ezekiel 37, 22 to 25. Ezekiel 37, 22 to 25. This book is supernatural, man. And the New Testament is the answer, the solution to this perplexing puzzle. Now watch this, guys, read. How many kings will God raise up to reign over Israel and the nations? And I will make them one nation in the land, on the mountains of Israel. And one king, not two, one king shall be over them all, and they shall be no longer two nations, and no longer divided into two kingdoms. They shall not defile themselves any more with their idols and their detestable things, or with any of their transgressions, but I will save them from all the backslidings which they have sinned, and I will cleanse them, and they shall be my people, and I will be their God. My servant David shall be king over them, and they shall all have one shepherd. Did you guys see it? Did you catch it? One king over them, and that's going to be my servant David. Do you see it? And he'll be their shepherd, right? Because in 25 it says, they and their children's children shall dwell there forever, and David my servant shall be their prince forever. Now, guys, catch it. God promises Israel that David will be their king, their shepherd. He'll be their king, their prince forever. Right? But how many kings? Well, someone can tell you, Millie, God is going to resurrect David at the end. Isn't David going to be resurrected with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? Won't he be resurrected? So, how do you know that it's not referring to David actually being resurrected physically to reign over Israel forever? See, someone could tell you that. Now, I agree with you. The term David here is not David himself, but the son of David, whom David typifies, because Scripture does call the coming king David. That's one of his names. But for my point right now, it doesn't matter whether you think it's actually David or this is referring to the son of David, because David typifies him, points to him, and in that sense, the coming king, who's from the line of David, he too is called David, because David foreshadows him. Okay, now, how many kings will reign over Israel forever? And by extension over the nations? How many? One, right? Okay. And that king is who, according to Ezekiel? According to Ezekiel, that king is who? David. Right? Millie gets it. You guys got it. Amen. But now we have a problem. Let's go to Zechariah 14, verse 9. Zechariah 14, verse 9. Zechariah 14, verse 9. And Yahweh will be king over all the earth, and on that day Yahweh will be one, and his name one. Who will be king over all the earth? Yahweh, the Lord. And he will be one, and his name one. So if there's going to be one king, and Yahweh will be king over all the earth, then how can David be the one king if Yahweh's going to be the one king? In fact, Zechariah 14, 16 to 17. Zechariah 14, 16 to 17, if you don't mind posting that. When Yahweh comes to the earth, he's going to personally rule from Jerusalem. He will physically come down and reign in Jerusalem. How do I know? Zechariah 14, 16 to 17. But then everyone who survives of all the nations that have come against Jerusalem, shall go up year after year to worship the King, Yahweh of hosts, and to keep the Feast of Booths. So the nations have to send representatives to worship him. Where? In Jerusalem, because that's where Yahweh's going to come. So physically, he's going to be in the earth. And he's going to be reigning from Jerusalem itself as the only king. And if any of the families of the earth do not go up to Jerusalem to worship the King, Yahweh of hosts, there will be no rain on them. Do you see how this works? There's going to be only one king, one shepherd, that's David, who will rule over Israel forever. But Zechariah says Yahweh will come, and he'll be the king of the earth, and all the nations must come and visit him and worship him in Jerusalem. The other thing, Psalm 268 says that God's anointed king will receive all the nations as his inheritance. But then Psalm 82:8 says, Yahweh God, Elohim, God will rise up to judge the earth and to inherit all the nations. So guys, can you help me understand? Who's actually going to inherit all the nations? Who's going to be the one king over all the earth, reigning from Jerusalem, ruling from Jerusalem? The anointed king, who's David? Or God? From these Old Testament texts, what is the answer? One king only, one shepherd forever. Says David in Ezekiel 37, 24, 25. Zechariah says it's Yahweh God. And Psalm 2 says the anointed king in Jerusalem from Zion will receive the nations as his inheritance. But Psalm 82:8 says God will receive the nations as his inheritance. So how do we reconcile these passages? Can someone help me? So you're saying the solution is Jesus, right? How is Jesus the solution? If these passages are not contradictory, and these passages are consistent, then the only way to reconcile these passages is that God himself will become a man, will become flesh, but not just any man, he's going to become a son of David. And that's what we find in the New Testament, right? Jesus is God who becomes flesh in order to become a son of David. So in him, he is David and God, who is the one king over all the earth and receives the nations as his inheritance. So he is the solution to this puzzle, right? The answer to this riddle. You see how it works? And that was a quick version. I gave you the quick response to this one. But I want to unpack it and go in depth. But I want to start with Deuteronomy 32:8 first, because it shows that the Old Testament anticipates a man who is God, anticipates God becoming man. And by the way, Ezekiel himself says that God will come and reign from Jerusalem, reign in Jerusalem. You want to see that passage? Ezekiel 43:2-7. Ezekiel 43:2-7. Now that really is confusing. So who's coming to reign as the one king, Ezekiel? David or God? And he says, yeah, David who is God, God who is David. Read here, guys. Read with me. Ezekiel 43, 2-7. Behold, the glory of God, the God of Israel, coming from the east, and the sound of his coming was like the sound of many waters, and the earth shone with his glory. And the vision I saw was just like the vision that I had seen when he came to destroy the city, and just like the vision that I had seen by the Chebar Canal, and I fell on my face. Now watch this. As the glory of Yahweh entered the temple by the gate facing east, the Spirit lifted me up and brought me into the inner court, and behold, the glory of Yahweh filled the temple. Now watch what happens. While the man was standing beside me, I heard one speaking to me out of the temple. All the way to 9, actually. And he said to me, Son of man, this is the place of my throne, and the place of the soles of my feet, where I will dwell in the midst of the people of Israel forever. Did you catch it? And the house of Israel shall no more defile my holy name, neither they nor their kings by their whoring and by the dead bodies of their kings at their high places. Did you see it? God speaking from the temple says, this place, Jerusalem, where the temple is, right? This place, Jerusalem, will be the place of my throne, the place of the soles of my feet, where I'm going to live in the midst of Israel forever. You see that? So in Ezekiel, it's God who's going to live in Israel forever, specifically Jerusalem. He's going to live in Jerusalem forever with his people, because Jerusalem will be the place of his throne. But wait, Ezekiel 37, 22-25 says, the one king who will reign over Israel forever is David. If there's going to be one king, and that's David, but then Ezekiel later on says that Yahweh himself is going to reign from Jerusalem and live in the midst of his people from Jerusalem forever. How do we reconcile that, man? How do we reconcile these passages? Here is explicit Old Testament evidence, black and white Old Testament evidence, where a king will come who's called David, and yet God is going to be the one king who will reign in Jerusalem forever over his people. So when we come to the New Testament and we find that Jesus is the son of David, and yet God in the flesh, we should expect that if we know what these passages are saying and are not contradictory. In fact, these passages should move people to anticipate someone who's God in the flesh and therefore from the house of David. And that's exactly what the New Testament unfolds. You see that? Let me give you another one. Jeremiah 3, 16-17. By the way, guys, I'm not even teaching yet, believe it or not. Jeremiah 3, 16-17. Guys, watch what Yahweh says again. When you have multiplied and been fruitful in the land, in those days, declares Yahweh, they shall no more say the ark of the covenant of Yahweh. It shall not come to mind or be remembered or missed. It shall not be made again. You won't make it again. Why? Why won't God allow them to make the Ark of the Covenant? Here's why. At that time, Jerusalem shall be called the throne of Yahweh, and all nations shall gather to it. Remember, all nations shall be your inheritance. All nations will be gathered to Jerusalem. Why? To the presence of Yahweh where? In Jerusalem. And they shall no more stumbly follow their own evil heart. Do you see it? Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Zechariah all confirm God himself will come to live in Jerusalem. Visibly, right? Come to Jerusalem and live in Jerusalem forever, reigning over the nations as king, and he expects all the nations to come and visit him in Jerusalem. That's what Jeremiah 3:17 said. That's what Zechariah 14:16-17 says. God himself will be there, right? And the city will be his throne. You see that? But now, you know what's really confusing? Jeremiah 30, verses 8-9. Let's 8 and 9. I was going to say verse 9, but let's go 8 and 9. And it shall come to pass in that day, declares Yahweh of hosts, that I will break his yoke from off your neck, this wicked tyrant king. I'll burst your bonds, and foreigners shall no more make a servant of him. But they shall serve Yahweh their God, and David their king, whom I'll raise up for them. Did you catch it? Same book of Jeremiah says, God will raise up David to be their king. But wait, Ezekiel says, there's only going to be one king over the earth, ruling over Israel. Right? And that will be David. But then Zechariah 14 says, Yahweh will come to be the king over all the earth, and he will be one, and his name one. And all the nations that survive will have to come and visit Yahweh in Jerusalem to worship the king, Yahweh of hosts. And that Ezekiel 43 says, Yahweh will reign in Jerusalem as he dwells in the midst of his people, because that's the place of his throne. Jeremiah 3 says Yahweh will be there in Jerusalem, because his throne will be there, and the nations will come to see Yahweh. Right? But here it's David their king. You see it? So if there's only one king, and that's David their king, but then Yahweh will be their king, king over all the earth, reigning from Jerusalem. What's going on here? Let me show you what's going on. Jeremiah gives you the answer to this perplexing mystery. What seems to be a contradiction. Jeremiah 23, 5-6. Jeremiah 23, 5-6. Here's the mystery. This one who's called David their king, whom God will raise up, whom they will have to serve the way they serve Yahweh, is not David himself, but one who comes from the line of David, whom David typifies and points to. Watch. Behold, the days are coming, declares Yahweh, when I will raise up for David a righteous branch. Now you see the difference? Jeremiah 30 verse 9 says, I'll raise up David their king. But earlier, and even afterwards, Jeremiah has already told the people that God is not going to raise up David per se, but a branch from David, a descendant from David, right, who will be righteous. And he shall reign as king and deal wisely. So he's the king, and shall execute justice and righteousness in the land. Now watch this. In his days, Judah will be saved, and Israel will dwell securely. And this is the name by which he, the branch of David, the king who is righteous, in whose days Judah will be saved, this is his name. This is what he'll be called. Yahweh is our righteousness. Do you catch it? He's not only called David, his name is also Yahweh is our righteousness. Do you catch it? Yahweh Zetkenu, also spelled this way. So is God going to raise up David, resurrect him? Well, God will resurrect the historical David to live forever. But that's beside the point. Is God going to raise up David himself? Or someone who comes from the line of David, who's called David because David points to him? Obviously the latter, because Jeremiah 23, 5-6 tells us, days are coming where Yahweh will raise up for David a righteous branch. And he'll be the king who reigns wisely, and in whose days Judah will be saved. But notice this branch of David, he's also Yahweh, our righteousness. Which then helps us understand Jeremiah 3, 16, 17, where it says that Yahweh himself will reign in Jerusalem. Yahweh's throne will be there, and the nations will come to Yahweh in Jerusalem to worship him, because this son of David is actually Yahweh in the flesh. So yes, David will reign, and yes, God will reign, because the coming king is both the son of David, whom David points to, and God in the flesh. But notice, Millie, Ezekiel and Jeremiah and Zechariah all agree, right? Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Zechariah agree. Yahweh God himself will come to Jerusalem, to Zion, where his throne will be, where he will dwell in the midst of his people to rule over them forever. That's Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Zechariah, all three, right? Jeremiah 3, 16-17, Ezekiel 43, 2-7, Zechariah chapter 14, the entire chapter, but specifically verses 1-5, verse 9, and verses 16-17. All of them say Yahweh God himself will come to Jerusalem, to Zion, to reign from there over the nations, over his people Israel, because that's the place of his throne, and that the nations must go and visit Yahweh there to worship him, otherwise he'll punish the nations who don't go to visit him. Yep, this will happen during the millennial reign of Christ. Exactly. And the Yahweh God who reigns in Jerusalem, who will require the nations to visit him, will be Jesus Christ, who's the son of David, God in the flesh. Exactly, Millie. This will be fulfilled in the millennial reign of Christ, and that will happen because Christ is risen. And that helps us understand the other passages, right? Where it says David, the branch of David, will rule. So there is no contradiction. But the prophets, by inspiration, are trying to let the people come to the realization that their God will become one of them, flesh and blood human being like them, from the line of David, in order to fulfill the promises made to David. That only makes sense during the millennial reign of Christ. You got it. Yep. Because if it's the age to come, meaning the eternal age, in which all wickedness will be eradicated from the earth, then no one can disobey anymore, because everyone who lives on in the earth during that period will be made morally incorruptible. Let's take 5 minutes, and then we'll talk about Deuteronomy 32.